But some have thought it foolish to bind themselves by a vow to obey anyone or to observe anything. For every good, the more freely it is practiced, the more virtuous it seems to be. But the more one is bound by necessity to observe something, the less freely it seems to be done. It seems, then, that the commendability of virtuous actions is derogated from by the fact that they are done out of the necessity of obedience or of a vow. But such men seem to be ignorant of necessity, for there is a twofold necessity, some kind of compulsion, and this diminishes the praise of virtuous actions because it is contrary to the voluntary. For that which is contrary to the will is forced. Now there is a certain necessity arising from an inner inclination, and this does not diminish the praise of the virtuous act, but increases it, for it makes the will tend more intensely to the act of virtue. For it is clear that the more perfect the habit of virtue is, the more strongly it makes the will tend to the good of virtue, and the less it fails from it. But if it comes to the end of perfection, it brings about a certain necessity to act well, as it is in the blessed, who cannot sin, as will be seen below. Yet, for this reason, nothing is lost either of the freedom of the will, or of acts of goodness. Now there is another necessity from the end, as when it is said to someone that it is necessary to have a ship in order to cross the sea. Now it is clear that neither this necessity diminishes the freedom of the will, nor the goodness of actions. Rather, what one does as if necessary to the end is praiseworthy from this very fact, and all the more praiseworthy, the better the end. Now it is clear that the necessity of observing what one has vowed, or of obeying him to whom one has put oneself, is not a necessity of compulsion, nor proceeding from an interior inclination, but from an order to the end. For it is necessary for the vower to do this or that, if the vow is to be fulfilled or obedience to be kept. Since then these ends are laudable, as to which man submits himself to God, the aforesaid necessity does not detract from the praise of virtue. But it is further to be considered that, as long as certain things are fulfilled which one has vowed, or which are prescribed for him by him to whom he has submitted himself for the sake of God, they are worthy of greater praise and reward. For it happens that there is one act of two vices, while the act of one vice is directed to the end of the other vice, so that when someone steals in order to commit fornication, the act is indeed greedy according to its species, but lustful according to its intention. But in the same way and in the virtues it happens that the act of one virtue is directed to another virtue, just as when someone gives his own so that he may have a friendship of charity with another. The act is indeed from its nature of generosity, but from the end of charity. But an act of this kind has greater praise from greater virtue, that is, from charity, than from liberality. Wherefore, even if it be remitted in that which is of liberality, then that which is directed to charity is more praiseworthy. Let us suppose, then, that someone is doing some work of virtue, for example fasting, or restraining himself from sexual intercourse. And indeed, if he does these things without a vow, it will be an act either of chastity or of abstinence. But if from a vow, it is further referred to another virtue, which is to vow something to God, namely to religion, which is more important than chastity or abstinence, as making us right with God. Therefore, the act of abstinence or continence will be more praiseworthy in him who does it out of a will, even if he does not so delight in abstinence or continence, because he delights in the superior virtue, which is religion. Again, that which is most important in virtue is the due end. For from the end the principle of good flows. If therefore the end be more eminent, even if in the act one should be more remiss, his act will be more virtuous. Just as if one proposes to walk a long way for the good of virtue, and another a short one, he will be more praiseworthy who aims at something greater for the sake of virtue, although he is slower in the progress of the way. Let him proceed. Now if a man does something for God's sake, he offers that act to God. But if he does this out of a wish, he offers not only the act, but also the power to God. And so it is clear that his purpose is to present something greater to God. Therefore his act will be more virtuous on the basis of the greater good intended, even if someone else seems more fervent in the execution. In addition, the will preceding the act remains in power throughout the whole prosecution of the act, and renders it praiseworthy, even when, in the execution of the work, he will not think of the purpose of the will for which the act begins. Now it is clear that he who vows to do something willed it more intensely than he who simply plans to do it, because he not only wanted to do it, but wanted to strengthen himself so as not to fail in doing it. Therefore, from this intention of the will, the execution of the vow is rendered with a certain laudable intensity, even when the will is either not actually brought into action or is said to have relented. In this way, therefore, what is done with a vow is more praiseworthy than what is done without a vow. But the rest being equal,